There we go. It's a little bit more warm, this lighting. That's all. Mm-hmm. Anyway, my name is Jeremy.
I'm Yana.
And we are Joined at the Unhip, a podcast about two people in their 30s that are dwindling away.
Yep.
Just getting knee-deep into the world of pop culture. I don't have a standard intro for this yet.
No.
I just fumble through it every time.
We fly by the seat of our pants every single time.
It's not a good look, really.
No.
Need to be more professional.
That's all right. I mean, listen. The only people who listen to this are people who know us.
Hey, that's not the ultimate goal here.
Well, yeah.
I mean, I'm not expecting us to get famous or anything off of this, but it's fun to record, so.
It is fun.
Everyone who's listening to it, thank you. And everyone who's not, please listen. I don't know why I'm talking to you on the show. Whatever. Okay. We are here to discuss a book that we read called The Hike by Drew Magary. It's actually a book I've been wanting to read for a long time, to the point where I had purchased it on both Audible and for Kindle and was just putting off reading it. I don't know why. I do weird shit like that. I have so many books that I've bought that I have not read yet.
I do that a lot. Yeah, I get a book and I'm like, oh, okay, I'm going to read this. And then 3 years later, it's still hanging out on my shelf and I haven't read it yet. Anyway,
I'm sorry if there's like a weird, awkward interruption here. We had some severe audio troubles.
Technical difficulties.
Courtesy of you-know-who. Who would have thought my complete lack of any kind of formal training with audio equipment would have translated into so many audio issues? I mean, who could have guessed?
Honey, I think you're doing a fantastic job.
You are too sweet.
And your complete lack of audio training, or whatever you just called it, I don't think is much of a hindrance. I think you're doing great.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Anyway, I bought the book. It sat on my digital shelf for years at this point.
And then I read it.
And Yana read it because she is a book-hungry machine, as I wish I could be, and was like, you have to read this book. And I was like, I want to. I just, I have a broken brain, and I'm not good at getting around to things like that.
I all but forced him.
Well, I bought the book in the first place, so it's not like the interest wasn't there.
I just very strongly recommended it.
It was basically a complete inversion of our discussion of revival, because I was like, you have to... I had tried to talk you into reading it, and you were kind of like meh on it, and then I told you that the ending of it kind of like fucked with me, and you were like, okay, well now I'm definitely gonna read it. Actually, the thing I said was, maybe you shouldn't read this because how much the ending of it messed with me, and that was like the catalyst.
Right. And then I was just like, oh, now you don't want me to read it? Well, I'm definitely gonna.
And now I know reverse psychology works on you like some kind of simile that I can't think of right now.
Good job,
I was going to say like a ton of bricks, but that's not a thing. That doesn't make any sense.
Yep.
Anyway, I got virtual stage fright.
Like a brick house.
It's mighty, mighty.
Yep.
Anyway,
letting it all hang out, you guys.
This book is called The Hike. And the writer, Drew Magary, I've followed for a little while. He's primarily a sports writer. He used to write for a website called Deadspin. He now writes for a site called Defector, after there was like a mass walk-off of talent at Deadspin. He's written articles for GQ. He's a fantastic writer in general. This is the first time I've tackled one of his books, and it's wildly different than I would have expected from just reading his, nonfiction articles about sports and
very
pop culture.
Imaginative.
Yeah, this dude has a crazy brain, and we're going to get into that a little bit. So, Yana, why don't you start us off by giving like a general overview of the plot of this book?
Quick summary.
By the way, let me jump in here. I'm sorry, honey. I didn't mean to give you the floor and then interrupt you. But we're going to try to avoid spoilers on this book until at least like the second half of it, because we do want people to read this. And if you haven't read it yet, maybe pause it when we hit the spoiler part and go and read it. It's a very short book, I will say that. It's only like a couple hundred pages.
And it moves at a really good clip.
Yeah.
Like it's paced very well.
It seems tailor-made for my ADHD brain, because some new things are constantly happening. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I'm sorry, honey. Continue.
So it's about a guy who is in like upstate Pennsylvania for a business trip. It's like a quick trip. He's staying at this little dinky hotel. And before his dinner meeting, he decides to go for a hike. He finds a little path out in the back of the hotel.
Hence the title.
Right. And he starts to follow this path, and goes for quite a hike.
Things happen.
And things happen. Yep.
It turns out it's really hard to discuss this book without discussing the specific things that happen.
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure how we're going to talk about it without spoilers. I think we're probably going to need to get into spoilers.
I don't know if we're going to need to get in them right
fairly
away.
Quickly.
But I wanted to get into like the overarching, like, I feel like this book is about like the journey that people go on throughout their entire like human existence.
Yeah.
Condensed down into like I would say like a series of metaphorical like vignettes. Like it's very,
so.
I mean it's very much like is it serialized? Is that the word I'm looking for? Where it's like one thing happens after episodic. Yes, it's very episodic. It's like one thing tumbles over into the next thing, and they're very sectioned off events or like situations that feel like they are somewhat disconnected from what came before and what came after, but perhaps not as much as it seems.
Yeah,
and it's very much just like a series of adventures, and it honestly reminded me of like I would say like the three other books that reminded me the most of are The Wizard of Oz, the original Pinocchio book by Carlo Collodi, and I think that's how you pronounce his name. There's probably like a more Italian way of saying it, but
Carlo Collodi.
Yes. Or, I think there's somewhere in between my flat enunciation and your borderline racist enunciation that's probably correct. But
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. And also Alice in Wonderland. It reminded me a lot of, that's kind of we talked about The Matrix last week. That's kind of I guess a hackneyed way of looking at any kind of fantasy, but like in terms of
Alice in Wonderland?
Yeah, because so many things are are meant to be, I feel like, are a riff on Alice in Wonderland. This doesn't feel like it's like doing the super hitting you over the head with the parallels to Alice in Wonderland.
It's the basic premise is very similar. It's about a guy who starts out in kind of the basic mundane real world, somehow finds his way by accident, into this other world, meets all these different kind of characters and has to go through this whole thing, and he's just trying to find his way home.
And similar to, I would say, both The Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland, the things that he comes across are not entirely unrelated to things that have happened to him in his real life.
Right.
There's like parallels there.
Yeah.
There's like callbacks. There's a lot of flashbacks to like his childhood and things like that. I don't want to get into specifics, but the way that all like ties together, I love stuff like that. I love things that jump around in time within the narrative and like dovetail with like previous events, that sort of thing. Or just the idea of like revisiting past events in your memory and what you would have done differently. Like there's a lot of that interesting stuff going on.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I don't have anything. Go ahead.
You were taking a breath like you had something.
I don't.
Why would you make that face?
I'm sorry.
Well, I don't have anything either, so it was a good podcast, you guys. 9 minutes, we crushed it.
Done.
Good book.
Done and done.
No, you're right. It's really hard to get into the specifics, or hard not to get into the specifics. I can't talk. It's a good thing I have a podcast.
So let me ask you this. When you were reading the book, when you first started it, and he kind of finds himself on this very extended hike, did you think, okay, he's definitely going to make his way home, or were you not sure? I was
sure. It's one of those things where a guy goes on an adventure, and there's a specific Japanese word for it. It's like a typically it happens to children in fiction. This word applies to, I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but it's a very specific genre trope of like a person gets pulled out of their mundane life and thrown into like an alternate world that's magical. And then at the end of it, they come back to their normal life, having grown, having had something happen to them that's like stuck with them. There's a lot of examples of this. There's like Labyrinth. There's like The Neverending Story. Yeah. It was big in the 80s. I feel like Princess Bride is a little bit like that, where he's transported by like being read the book. One of the reasons I even kind of a little bit didn't hate the Dark Tower movie is because it kind of did that with that series, where it's like a kid goes on an adventure in an alternate world and then comes back. Like that's kind of how they did that to that movie. And this is very much like that, except the difference is that it's happening to like a 38-year-old man.
It is very much like that. And especially in the beginning of the book, I found myself thinking about Labyrinth actually quite a bit. And when the book first started out, my thinking was, okay, he's going to go, he's going to like face his challenges, and then he's going to get home. And as the book went on, I got progressively less certain that he was going to get home, to where I genuinely didn't know. I was like, wow, he might not. Like, I didn't know where this book was going to go. Yeah. And I mean,
it very much,
yeah,
it zigs when you think it's going to zag.
Right.
And a lot of, I would say, like, I think one of the reasons I started reading this when I first bought it, and I think one of the reasons I stopped is because at the beginning of it was, like, they do a really good job of making everything seem kind of mundane. And even the first thing he encounters on his hike seems to be telegraphing, like, a different kind of story than I thought it was going to be.
What's the first thing he encounters?
The dog face man.
Oh, yeah.
That's not that much of a spoiler. He encounters them in the first, like, 20 pages of the book.
Yeah.
They're men with, like, wearing, like, dog masks. And I was like, oh, this is going to be, like, a horror thing. He's encountering, like, these, like, Jason Voorhees type dudes. Mm-hmm. But that's, like, just the very tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, that's not what it is.
So I thought it was going to be, like, fairly predictable. It is so not predictable. It's so... Drew Magary has, like, a crazy imagination.
Yeah.
And it's funny because it's great in that it'll bring up something so, like, crazy and imaginative and scary or gross, and it seems kind of out of left field, and then you read on and then you think back to it and you're like, oh no, wait, well, this ties back to this. And sometimes that's apparent when the thing shows up, and sometimes there's, like, a little bit more of an overarching concept there. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's I will say the thing that's funny is, like, he talks about living in Maryland all the time. I believe Drew Magary lives in Maryland as well. And there's, like, don't want to get too deep into, like, what happens, but there's a crab that plays a role in the story. And I was kind of just like, this seems so random and so weird. Why a crab? And then, like, I thought about it, like, it was like, of course, a Maryland guy. Right. They love crabs. That's, like, their entire thing. Like, they have, you know, all of their cars have bumper stickers that are, like, the state flag in the shape of a crab. So it makes sense. He's got a rep for Maryland, and the character is from Maryland as well. I mean, it feels very much like one of those things where I know a little bit about Drew Magary from what I've read of him, and he is, like, a guy
there's definitely, like, parallels.
Yeah, he's a guy with a family, and he's, like, in his 40s now, I think, and, like, you know, the guy in the book feels very much like a stand-in for the author, mm-hmm. which is very common.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's quite interesting.
Do you have any questions or general opinions on the book?
I mean, when was the last time you read a book that was, like, this level of fantasy? Like,
I don't read a ton of fantasy typically. Mm-hmm. So it's been a while since I've read, like, a fantasy novel.
Since the last Dark Tower book you read?
Yeah, that's true. Dark Tower's fantasy.
Yeah. This kind of reminded me of, like, it had elements of Dark Tower in it for me because it's very episodic. The Dark Tower books are very episodic, and this is. Yeah. And there's just a lot of weird left turns. There's just a lot of weirdness, which is something I always love. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'm not a great literary scholar, so I can't get too deep on, like, I don't know, the
symbolism.
The symbolism in this book is pretty overt. Like, he encounters, spoiler alert, like a giant cricket, and at one point he talks about how there was, like, a cricket in his house that was driving him nuts, that freaked him and his wife out. So, like, the metaphors or the, you know, whatever you want to call them are not super subtle a lot of the time, but they're always entertaining, I would say. Like, the way that they're staged and just the randomness of it.
What did you think about some of the surprises in this book? Did you see them coming?
No, I didn't see any of this book coming. It was very, like I said, I thought I had it pegged the first time I tried to read it and was a little bit, like, you know, a lot of times you watch, like, the first 20 minutes of a movie and you're like, okay, I know where this is going. Mm-hmm. And most of the time that's true. And you've watched the whole movie and you're like, okay, I pretty much saw this coming.
Yeah.
And that's true of a lot of narratives. And sometimes you're like, you're rubbing your hands together like, ooh, I know where this is going, and you're excited. And sometimes you're like, I know where this is going. I've seen it 100 times. And I kind of thought that at the beginning of this. I've read a ton of Stephen King books. So when a guy starts getting chased by what looks like serial killers in the woods, I'm like, okay, this seems like whatever. And it doesn't do itself a great service by him calling it The Hike, because it's very vague.
It sounds mundane. Yeah,
and I think there was kind of a point to that, but it probably didn't help with like book sales or popularity or whatever. But the cover is pretty cool, and is kind of indicative. I never really paid attention to it, but it's pretty indicative of the crazy shit that happens in it.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff that this character Ben encounters on his path is on the cover, and it looks pretty cool.
Okay, I'm really bad at speaking in vagaries, so I think I'm just gonna
go ahead and start the spoilers.
Start the spoilers because
okay.
I finished this book today, and I've been chomping at the bit to talk to Yana about it. And anytime we decide we're going to review something on the podcast, we try to put like the kibosh on talking about it ahead of time.
Yeah.
And I finished this book today. Yana finished it like a week ago, and
like 2 or 3 days ago.
Really?
I finished it earlier this week.
Oh, I thought you finished it.
No.
Anyway, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
We've both been itching to talk about it to each other. And so we're going to get full spoilers now. If you have not read the book and want to read the book, I would suggest turning off the podcast now.
Yeah.
And going and getting it. I'm sure there's copies of it anywhere. Get it on Kindle or what have you.
And
The Hike by Drew Magary.
Go read this book.
Yeah, it's
and
pretty great.
And if you hate it, I'm sorry, but I thought it was excellent.
Yeah. I mean, it's a quick read. It's like a quick, fun read, I would say.
Is that when you make recommendations, honey, do you ever get like kind of nervous? Like when I recommend something to somebody, and in the back of my mind, I'm always like, oh gosh, like I'm really raving about this thing. What if they end up hating it? And then they never want to take any of my recommendations again, or think I'm a dummy for liking this thing.
I only think about that whenever, like, I try to cater my recommendations to specific people.
I try to do that too, but sometimes it just doesn't work.
Like, I was recommending Revival to you as I was reading it, and then when I got to the ending of it, I was like,
maybe not,
because this book kind of fucked with me, and I don't necessarily want Yana to be tripped up the way that I was.
Well, I try to cater my recommendations to this book. I've kind of been recommending to everyone because I think like I just think it's really interesting and there's kind of something for everyone. But anyway,
I think I'm recommending this book to everybody because
I'm recommending,
it's so short.
Yeah, so I like this has the Yana Battelle gold stamp of approval. But if you don't like it, I'm sorry ahead of time, and feel free to reach out and tell me why you didn't like it, and we can have a nice little discussion.
It's like the Oprah's book club sort of thing.
That's right. What?
Nothing. I think I feel like book recommendations in general are more loaded than because when I recommend something, I don't read as much books as you, or as much books. God damn, I need to read more.
So much books.
I don't read as many books as you, and when I recommend things, it's usually either a movie or TV show or a video game. Now, the TV show or a video game can be a bit of a time, investment, but a book is, you're like, I mean, do you remember? It's
a little bit of a commitment.
Do you remember when we first started dating, I bought you like a couple books that were recommended to me that were like known. And
you bought me A Winter's Tale, and it was this thick. It was really, really big.
It's like 6 inches thick, but it had just been made into a movie. It was like a movie that was coming out that looked really cool. I knew you were into like fantastical things and romance,
and I wasn't all that into it.
And I bought you a goddamn textbook to read, and it still sits on our shelf, or maybe you threw it away. I don't remember.
I think we may have gotten rid of it.
But yeah, like books are like that. They're loaded. Yeah. There's so much expectation there. I remember also getting you. Was it me who bought you Divergent or?
Yes, and I read Divergent.
Yeah.
And that was the only book I read in that series.
And you were. That's
enough for me.
This is when we first started dating, and you would like text me like, so much of this book makes no sense. That's not how the human mind works.
Yeah, because I was in my social work graduate program. Yeah, and I was like, this is not how people function. What is This is ridiculous.
Honey, people's brains only have one trait and one trait only. But if you have more than 4 traits, then you are clearly the chosen one. Especially if you're like a cute redheaded girl. Mm-hmm. And so, then you got to lead a revolution or some bullshit. Like,
anyway.
That book, I watched the movie of that and I thought it was terrible. And I remember thinking it felt like it was 4 hours long. And I remember just thinking it felt like somebody was like describing, it was like somebody who had the Hunger Games on in the background while they were doing something else, trying to explain the plot of the Hunger Games. Like it was just like that disconnected from it. Anyway, that's our treatise on books in general.
Yep.
Book recommendations are very loaded. That's what the whole point of that was. Yeah. And so
what did you want to talk about? What did you want to start out with talking about this book?
With like spoilers?
Yes, like full-on spoilers.
Now that we're into full-on spoiler land, okay. Digression about the shitty books I purchased.
Full-on spoilers.
I want to say I love Crab. Crab is my favorite.
Crab is cool.
I mean, a lot of the characters in this book are... They're delightful and not in the book enough, I would say.
I like Fermona.
Fermona, the giantess, is fantastic. I had a hard time getting a sense of how big she actually was because he describes her as being like 30 feet tall, but then she's like swallowing people whole, which seems like she would be like 100 feet tall. I don't know. It was a little hard to picture how big she was.
Yeah.
I think that was like kind of who cares? It's like who gives a shit?
Right.
But like her attitude, it was kind of, I feel like he drew inspiration from The Big Friendly Giant. That's what that section kind of reminded me of.
Really?
I love that book.
I never read that.
I love that book when I was a kid, and just like the weird interactions between the kid and the giants, it kind of reminded me of that a little bit. But the dialogue, her like weird, like modernish dialogue while being like a bloodthirsty monster.
So I listened to this book on audiobooks, and the man who narrates it, he did a really good job with the male characters and a not so great job with the female characters.
Really?
Like some of the choices he made, like Fermona sounded kind of odd, Mrs. Blackwell sounded kind of odd.
Well, it's a limiting medium in that way.
Yeah.
I do kind of like when audiobooks will be like a full-on radio play where they have different actors playing. Yeah. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I like that too.
It's pretty rare, though.
But he read Fermona almost like a 1940s kind of gangster. She's like, hey, now come on, you see?
Oh, really?
A little bit.
I did not read her that way at all.
I didn't really either. It was like an odd kind of choice.
She was like a gangster's mall.
Yeah, a little bit. So, and the way I interpreted her was like almost like a teenager.
Yeah.
She
was like a
very outgoing
college student or
very
something.
Outgoing, very friendly, like very focused on her own needs and her own entertainment, and everyone else, like she just didn't really care. Mm-hmm. She was looking like she was thinking about herself.
Yeah, very self-involved.
Right. But at the same time was just so friendly and bubbly about like every situation.
Well, like when he first talks to her on the radio and she's like, hurry up and come on over. And he's like, why?
Yeah.
And she's like, because I'm going to eat you.
She's like, I'm going to kill you.
Yeah, that was really funny. And that was like without context because you just hear her voice over
right.
like the CB
yeah.
radio.
And she, when he gets upset, like after his fight, she's just like, oh, is that the first time he killed someone?
Yeah.
Oh,
it's very like, very patronizing.
Yeah. But she's... Yeah, she's a trip.
I mean, one of the things I did, because I'm a child who sees everything in terms of like movie adaptations, I was like trying to cast it in my head. I still think if this was made into a movie, the crab should be voiced by J.K. Simmons. I feel like just... Because his attitude of like, I'm over here, shithead, like was very... Kind of reminded me of his character in... J.K. Simmons' character in... what was that... Something Springs, Palm Springs, kind of reminded me of his character in Palm Springs. He kept calling the character Shitbird, and that kind of reminded me, I don't know, that gruff sort of, and given the twist, I mean, additional spoiler alert here, that it turns out it's Ben in 10 years in the future having transformed into a crab, and they mention when he's transforming that it like compresses his voice and makes it gruff and everything, and he's, much older and much more grizzled. And the more I thought about this book after finishing it today, or just like as I was going through it, the more I realized that like a lot of the steps of the journey were like tie back to his his life in terms of just like and not just his life, but like I feel like the average like American human existence. Like he's dealing with like the two big scary dudes that look like dogs because he was attacked by a Rottweiler as a child, and that's the first thing. That's like his first traumatic memory, and that was the first thing he encountered in the woods. And then like there's just like certain things, like at one point he has to deal with Fermona, which is kind of like I feel like it's like a weird metaphor for like when you get to be like a teen and you're dealing with girls, because she, like you said, she acted like a teenage girl, and I feel like it was sort of like because extreme spoiler about like the reveal in this, a lot of this stuff is just coming out of his brain, and he's making it happen because it's coming out of his subconscious.
Not Fermona though. The executive producer says that Fermona was boilerplate. He just reacted to her.
Right,
really
but
nicely.
I'm saying that like as a literary metaphor, it kind of felt like a male's experience with women, where you're kind of confounded by their behavior when you first start trying to meet girls.
And intimidated by them,
yeah,
right?
You're intimidated by them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're sort of baffled by their like impulses and what they want and that sort of thing. And I thought that the whole like building the castle portion where he spends 10 years in slavery.
That was rough.
That was harrowing. And I was like, oh, well, this is just capitalism. This is what happens when you're an adult. You are like really you were just put to work as building a thing.
Oh, wow. Good for you for seeing that. I didn't really.
That was, well, I mean, it's, it's probably like a Rorschach. You can see what you want. But I was like, this whole thing feels like it has metaphors for the steps of the human life. And, the biggest time chunk he spends in this is working. And that's what happens to everybody. You spend the majority of your day working. You spend the majority of your life working. And he's like spending all this time in these rough conditions dealing with like multiple levels of management. He's got the ghosts, and he's got the weird dude who keeps flying overhead. Yeah, the smokes. And then the weird skinless monsters that keep occasionally popping out of the ground.
Yeah, the whole curiously undead thing was cool.
Yeah,
when
the different.
He finds that book.
I mean, this book reminded me so much of playing a video game. Like so much. I sort of got Drew Magary was deep into gaming or something when he wrote this, because like the idea of like if you stay on the path you'll be fine, because a lot of games are like that. You like have a little arrow that's guiding you through the open world, and when you veer off of it, bad things can happen. Or it's like the whole path thing reminded me of like playing an old like Nintendo game where it's like you just go from left to right, and that's what he was doing. He was just going in one direction. It was one dimension. He was moving forward and just encountering weird random enemies and bosses
How do you think
have specific ways of being defeated.
How do you think Sisko's experience of the path was different from Ben's experience of the path? I mean,
obviously he was coming from he seemed way more accepting of the path, because he's literally like an explorer from the 1400s. So his entire goal was to go to a distant land that was like hopefully magical. Like, so it was interesting that he seemed a little less fazed by everything. Like he was kind of just like, isn't this crazy? We're in this magical land. And Ben was just like, no, this is not right. This is not how things are supposed to go. And he's like, what do you mean? I was sent off to discover like the new world.
I've done it.
Yeah, this is the new world. I'm going to bring things back to my family. And I love that character. I thought he was great.
I loved Sisko. I thought, which again, the narrator, fabulous job with Sisko.
Oh, really?
He did such a good like Spanish accent.
I think I only listened to little bits and pieces of the audiobook version when I was driving. But.
And also, I think it's interesting, like how deeply rooted Sisko is in his faith, which obviously everyone back then was, and Ben is not. And I think that almost blind faith really helps see Sisko through. He has this like unflinching belief that Jesus is going to get him through it.
Yeah, he's like, God is doing all this, and I believe him to have a good
and so it must be
it.
good, right? In the end, and Ben is decidedly less certain about that.
Well, it worked for Sisko when he prayed, and it got him through the wall of fire. So I liked that the book didn't really like. It was like Ben doesn't have faith and Sisko does, and it works for both of them.
Right. There's no right or wrong way to do it. I think it made it easier for Sisko. But, then again, we don't know what his path looked like before he met Ben or after they split up.
Now, did you catch what I thought was a semi-obvious throwback to Castaway? Because this reminded me of Castaway a few times. But there's one big dramatic one toward the end that reminded me of Castaway.
Oh, yeah, when he leaves the little rock behind.
Yeah, and because he spent 10 years not seeing his family, and he pretended that rock was his son, and he left it behind when he escaped and was like all choked up about it.
Yeah.
I was like, Jesus, this guy's like brain is broken by this.
Yeah, that was really sad.
Yeah, and like that movie, this did a good job of like making you feel like the gut-wrenching feelings of someone like that.
It's funny that you mentioned Castaway because I was thinking of that during the part where the smokes destroy his tent.
Yeah.
They like set his tent ablaze and all of the things that he had in it that like remind him of his children obviously go up and smoke with it. And I mean, they're like dumb little artifacts, right? It's like, it's nothing that important, but it's like when Wilson floated away in Castaway. It's like, this is the only thing that this man has that brings him any kind of comfort.
He has stuffed animal.
And any kind of like connection to the life that he had before this whole thing started. And now it's just gone.
Well, that part, I think the thing that bummed me out the most about that part was the fact that he was in the desert and that was his only shelter. And it was like, this book does...
And he at least had books to read in there.
Yeah, this book kind of steals a little bit from Harry Potter in that there's a lot of like expanded indoors. Like everyone on the path seems to have like a bag that... whatever bag they're carrying when they go on their trip becomes like magically expanded that you can fit everything into it. And then he has a tent that's like this big palatial room that's full of books and has like a nice bed. My whole thing when that happened was like, oh, his bed. When he's going to sleep in the desert.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
It's very much, the path giveth and the path taketh away.
I think one of my favorite quotes of the book where he said something like, and especially this has even more impact when you realize that it's kind of his own brain doing it to him, where he said this is his brain, or he said something like, this is classic abuse behavior where you do something traumatic to someone and then you reward them for them afterwards, or you it's like cruelty followed by a kindness, right? And I was like, that's very interesting. And that is like the way of abusive behavior where they're like, I didn't mean to hit you, or you shouldn't make me hit you, that sort of thing. Like, I feel like I like that the book called that out, where it's like, this is like the being in a cycle of abuse where it's like they do just enough to keep you reeled in, but then they keep just abusing you.
Right, just enough to kind of give you hope that things are going to get better.
Exactly. Like I can't count the number of times in this book where like something terrible happens and he comes and he's like starving and he comes across like a feast of some kind.
Right. Yeah. So the path, I mean, it gives him the things he needs. He has like the magic seeds. He has, I know, out of context, it's like, what?
So weird.
Yeah, like he and Cisco get to the villa where they can kind of chill out for a little bit, and he just stays there for like a week. Yeah. Cisco is ready to move on. Ben needs a little bit of time.
Yeah, that part was pretty cathartic, where he's just like, I'm just gonna eat from this. Yeah, eat from this thing,
never-ending buffet.
Yeah, and like stand waist deep in the bay and just drink beers, like. And that was like a really touching scene where Cisco was like, I need to move on, and we're going to end our friendship at its highest point before we can disappoint each other, before it gets bad. Like, this is the best way for a friendship to end. And I thought that was really sweet.
After we busted out each other's teeth.
That part was hilarious.
That was brutal.
Yeah. His description... I tell you, his description of what it felt like to have your tooth ripped out made me ever want to go to a dentist ever again. He was like, the roots feel like they're dug all through my body. Yeah. As he was like pulling them out.
Yeah, it was pretty terrible.
I mean, it was kind of a dick move for Cisco to be like, well, you have to pull one of your teeth out so we're even. I was like, well... But his whole thing was like you have to prove that you can make sacrifices.
You're a man of sacrifice.
Yeah. Yeah. That was a very interesting character. I did like that because he was from the 1400s and was like a... I don't know, I don't know what the politics of that were then, but he basically hated every other race from every other country. Like, he hated the French, he hated the Italians,
the English,
he hated the English. Yeah. Well, there was like a moment where he said something like, "It's okay that guy died because he was English," or something like that. I forget exactly what the quote was, but it was like it was like commenting on some tragic thing, and he's like, "Well, he sounds like he was English, so it was fine." Yeah, this book is very funny. It's very funny. Yeah. It like alternates between like being really funny and being very tragic and making you like feel the tragedy, like the like revisiting of events from the main character's childhood to like his inner turmoil at dealing with the situation is very real. It feels very like grounded.
Yeah, which is why, you know, like I said earlier, when I was maybe about a third of the way through with this book, I really was not sure if he was going to get home. Well, and to me, I came to a part toward the end where I was like, the ending is going to make it or break it for me with this book. If he does not get home, I
hate this book.
I hate this book because after all the BS that this poor guy got put through, if he doesn't get some kind of if he doesn't get this ultimate reward at the end, I was going to be really upset. He does, thankfully. Well, I was happy.
Yeah, and I was happy too. And my whole thing about this book that's interesting is that, I've often said, like on Twitter and stuff, I said that like there's really no such thing as like an adventure when you're in it, because then it's just like a series.
It's just a pain in the ass.
It's just a series of ordeals. Like it's just like a series of problems, or like you being in legit danger. Like anything. Right. And this book is kind of funny because like you describe the events of the book and it sounds like an amazing, fantastical journey, but because it's so anchored inside the guy's mind and how he's dealing with it and the realities of like, you know, the minute to minute like physicalities of like having to climb a cliff or having to deal with like going days without food, it's like a lot more visceral in describing that sort of thing. So like the broad view is like it's a fantastical adventure, but the movie or the book grounds you so much in the guy's head that you're like, this is just horrible. Like everything this guy's dealing with is terrible.
I was surprised by how many things go wrong for him. So like he has these kind of things that he needs to do, right? He has to like fight the cricket to make it to the control panel, and he needs to, you know, he needs to like take the hovercraft wherever, and like there's all these sort of missions, right? But how much goes wrong for him and how like physically beat up he gets. Like he gets really knocked around.
I was surprised he wasn't like Roland, where he like lost digits or something.
Yeah.
Like, you know.
Yeah.
I do like how very much like a video game, he just gets these like power-ups that are catered to him specifically. And of course you find out it's because it all came out of his own mind. But like
what? What do you mean?
Like when the seeds give him exactly what he needs when he throws them down. But also like when they escape in the truck and there's just like a syringe full of cortisone in the glove box. Yeah. Stuff like that I thought was like really funny. Yeah. And it was very reminiscent of like you know, Alice in Wonderland's like little bottles that say "drink me." You know, there's a lot of that in this book. I feel like my description earlier of like it being harrowing and an ordeal makes it sound joyless. It's very much not joyless. It's very creative.
It is very creative, and there's a lot of good. There's mostly bad stuff that he encounters on the path, but there's good stuff too. Like
it's a good contrast. It
replenishes him when he needs it.
Well, it creates like an amazing contrast of like the funny, weird, wild shit that's happening, and then like just how difficult it is to deal with all of it. Yeah. And it's an interesting exercise in like being on an adventure and what that really does to the human body and like what.
What did you think of the end?
Thought it was weird, and I thought, just like any other aspect of the book, it just took some weird zags, like the part where he like splits himself in half because he realizes he's still on the path and he can do anything. So, and he has to choose two doors, one to stay on the path where he can basically have whatever he wants and do whatever he wants.
Right, it's like heaven.
Yeah, it's like paradise. Or go back to his mundane life with his family. And he decides to split himself in half into he had, at this point, he's 10 years older, or had at one point been 10 years older and just like beaten up and scarred and just like probably like way more muscular because he was like lifting. He literally built a castle with his bare hands, and he splits himself off into his younger self from right before he went on the hike and his older self from after the hike, and sends the older self off to paradise, and he himself goes back to his family. And I thought that was like a weird digression, the whole thing with this two selves, but he did that because he wanted to preserve the existence of because the guy said whatever door you go through, the other world will be like gone. Mm-hmm. So he wanted to just preserve the existence of both, which I thought was like a weird, interesting, like...
Yeah, that's true.
But I am ultimately glad he went back to his family, and the reveal after he goes back to his family. So at the beginning of this book, they do a lot of flashbacks to his family. His family seems like, they're a lot, but he has a loving wife, and they have like a good relationship, if a little like, under the strains of typical marital strains,
yeah, they
and
have
having three boys. Three kids.
Yeah.
I was just thinking of the Righteous Gemstones. They had three boys.
But they're like all three kids under the age of 10.
Yeah.
So
it's
young.
a lot. They have a lot to contend with. And his wife is a night nurse who has had to deal with like a lot of bullshit at her job. And early on in the book, they contend with this situation where he wakes up one morning when she's off work, and he comes downstairs and she's like a mess. She's like a wreck on the couch, and she talks about how like she can't talk about it, and is like mumbling and saying something about killing someone, and he doesn't press her for it, but she's like kind of an empty shell of a person for a little while after that, and then she eventually snaps back into place. So they seed that early on in the book, and they seed so many other things about this guy's life that are traumatic.
You don't really think about
You don't think twice about it, because it's one of the, you find out about how he got attacked by a dog as a child, other things he's gotten into trouble with. His like dad was like a drunken mess when he was a child, and he realizes at the very end, looking in his wife's eyes, them like just sort of having this moment of, she was on the path too.
When he makes it back to his family.
That was when he found her that way. It was after her going on the path.
Right. It was after her own hike.
Yeah, it was after her own hike.
Yeah.
And so they both have been on this, and they can't discuss it because that's one of the terms of returning to your normal life. But now they have this like crazy connection that they've both been on this thing, and she realizes it after looking at him as well.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was like that was a really interesting, I guess you would call it like a stand-in for like just this unspoken, indescribable bond two people can have, and sometimes it's like over past trauma, sometimes it's just pure, like it's just a connection. There's like no way of really
and obviously her hike was different from his. She encountered different things,
but I'm sure it was harrowing because it comes out of like your subconscious, and you don't realize it.
Neither one of them can talk about it with the other, but they still they know the general gist. And I thought that was really nice time. Because now, they can commiserate with one another about it.
Wordlessly, basically.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was really good.
Yeah, it was like he spends a lot of the book just being like, I just want my family back.
Yeah.
And, talking about his wife.
That was really sad also when he spends all that time building the castle, and at one point he says to Cisco, like, I can barely remember my children's faces. Right. And I know that when I get back to them, they're not even going to be the same children.
Yeah, it's like Interstellar.
So much time has passed. They're going to be completely different people. And just, the mourning.
It reminded me of
that lost time.
Reminded me a little bit of like Interstellar, or even like Flight of the Navigator, where it's like you don't even know if there's going to be like a weird time jump. Maybe he comes back and his kids are 30 years older.
Yeah.
Or he comes back on the same day that he left, but now he's 10, 15 years older and like a grizzled mess, and they won't even recognize him. So it's like you're not really sure what the rules are. I mean, this fantastical world he's in is like so malleable and changes so much that you're not even sure, like, what is he in a time warp?
Right.
And they don't really explain.
No, just... the path.
The universe picks out people to put on this path, and their mind determines what happens on it.
And you walk it for however long you're supposed to walk it. It's different for different people.
Yeah. I feel like that probably annoyed people.
And there you go. What?
There just wasn't enough of an explanation as to why. You know?
Oh, see, I like that.
Well, I did too.
Yeah, in this context. I will oftentimes get annoyed when there's not enough of an explanation, but...
Well, if it just got to like...
I was okay.
I mean, if it just got to like him walking through a doorway and being back home with no explanation, that would have been annoying. Mm-hmm. But the fact that he got enough of an explanation as to where the stuff was coming from, it was coming from his own mind.
Yeah.
And like it was funny because we recently watched the Matrix movies, and it kind of reminded me a little bit of like a more comedic version of the second Matrix movie, where he's going to like get answers from this like mystical place, and it's just like some old dude in a room who's like explaining to him how things work. Only in this book it's like much more interesting and better because the guy's funny, and he basically acts like an old 70 something like movie producer. He's like dressed in a white
linen
suit, a linen suit with like Hawaiian print shirt and like wearing sunglasses. And I think the book even like the prose was like rocking shades indoors or something like that. The prose of this book is great, the way that it describes things. And there's just so many great details. The fact that they defeated the what were they called? The ghosts? What were they called?
Smokes.
Yeah, they defeated the Smokes
with a little vacuum,
with a dustbuster by just trapping them. And the part where there's like kind of a part where he like becomes almost like the one, where he's like, fuck this, I'm in charge.
Yeah.
And he like just like beats the shit out of like the little guy and at one point sucks up one of the Smokes and then just like breathes it out as fire. That was really weird. But he just basically realizes he's the producer and can do what he wants.
Yeah.
And he basically just is like, all right, well, I'm going to use this power to escape and get back to my family, which is pretty crazy, actually. Like the fact that he didn't be like, okay, I can do whatever I want now, so let's go crazy with this. He was like, no, I want to get back to Teresa.
No, I mean,
Teresa is the goal.
Yeah, he was very goal-oriented.
Yeah.
That was what he wanted to do. He wanted to get back to his wife and family, and
reading this book really made me like want to
did.
spend more time with you and the kids. I was like, just reading about a guy who's like so misses his family so bad that he's literally like naming a rock after his child and like putting it to bed at night.
And I mean, it's the classic thing of like, as you're going through your life, things fade into the background, and you're just kind of going through the day to day and everything gets dull and, yes, dear, no, dear. And you kind of have blinders on. And then the minute that something happens to where that mundane life is in danger and you're not sure if you're ever going to get back to it again, it's all you want, right? All you want is that like boring life with your loved ones.
What's funny is like, I don't know, did you experience any of that when we're going to get a little bit personal here, but did you experience any of that when you got divorced the first time?
Where I wanted my life back?
Where you kind of missed the mundanity of being in like a domestic situation? Because I did. Like I was like I was like crashing on a friend's couch, and I knew that, okay, our relationship wasn't working and it shouldn't continue further. But like there was like a part of me that was like, I miss being like, in like a nuclear family and just like the comfort of that notion.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that I kind of connected with personally. And ultimately I realized it was like for the best. But like there was just something about that like security blanket feeling.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, people feel a lot of things all at once. And so I think that's a very normal thing. And I definitely had that where, I knew that the separation was a good thing. I knew that that's what needed to happen. Not a good thing, but it's what needed to happen.
Right.
But I missed kind of being on my own because I had to stay with my parents for a while.
I feel like this book just does a good thing of being like, oh, wow, like, whether this thing's working or not, there's something about that kind of lifestyle that's very comforting, that's very, even when you're bored of it or something's going wrong in it, it's very much, like, worthwhile.
Yeah.
And I thought that was pretty interesting. We've gotten really quiet with our conversation.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's all right. I'm just looking at the waveform on the recording, and I'm just like, oh, this is getting a little more flat now that we're getting too real on the podcast. Sorry, that was like a little too personal maybe, but I was like,
that's all
just
right.
the whole like domestic life as like You know, I know it's not for everybody, but like, you asked me the other day how I thought this book was going to end because I was still reading it. And I said, I think the ultimate lesson of the book, and I was kind of half right, I'd say. I said the ultimate lesson of the book is that, like, the thing that you were bored of before, that you sort of like took for granted, the things that you have, the beautiful wife, the beautiful children, the you know, the nice house, other people would go through, go to hell and back to have that. They would absolutely. There's people out there, no matter what you think, no matter how like mundane you think your life is, how middling, how much you think you don't have, there are so many people out there that would literally go to hell and back to get what you have. And I thought that that's how the book was going to end, and I think it was kind of right, because that's what he did, and that's what
and not just other people, but you yourself.
Right.
You know, this thing that you have that you don't always appreciate. When you're faced with the prospect of losing it forever, it's all you want, and you will fight tooth and nail to get back to it.
There's several times in this book where he's sort of given the option to like commit suicide. Yeah. And it's kind of like, I don't know, like the being imprisoned for 10 years and having to do manual labor the entire time. I'm like, I might have killed myself at that point. I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things. It's kind of like we talked about last week with, you know, what would you do in the situation of the Matrix? It's like, I think we would all be Cyrus or Cypher. In this situation, it's like, I don't know if I would put up with that. I might just off myself. But he was like determined to get back to what he had.
Right.
Like,
well, I was kind of thinking about that with the end of this book, too, when he had the choice between going back to his real life or going, you know, to paradise, where he could essentially construct whatever life he wanted. So, like, he could have his wife and children there, and, you know, it could be perfect.
Well, he mentions that, but it, like, wouldn't be real.
Right. But, yeah, and that's what he says, but it's not real. It's not the same.
It's not something I worked hard to earn throughout my life, like my actual life.
But then the producer has a point, too. You know, he says, well, what's real? Like, you've experienced things on this path that to you have felt completely real. And so if you keep going, whatever you produce and whatever you make is going to feel just as real to you.
Yeah, and honestly,
it's the whole thing of like, the perception is key. You know, what you perceive to be real is real to you.
So this might be like loaded, don't be, you know, obligated to answer one way or the other, but what would you have chosen?
I know. I thought that too. I think I would have, I don't think I would have come up with the solution to split myself in two.
No, that was insane. When he stabbed
really
himself
great.
in the head with that thing, I was like, what the fuck?
Like, dragged it down, I would have gone back to my regular life.
I think I would have too, because the way that he described, I mean, this just makes us so boring, and so like people just being like, you guys are la-di-da, whatever, you love your life, fuck you.
Whatever.
Good for you. But like, I feel like the way he explained the path, even moving forward when you control it, sounded kind of dull. Like, do you remember... Did you ever see that episode of The Twilight
Zone? Yeah.
Where the guy thinks he's in heaven and it just keeps giving him what he wants over and over and over again, and it turns out it's actually hell. Yeah. Like, that's what it sounds like. It sounds like, I mean, you don't play many games, but like if you go to play a video game and you have all of the cheats turned on, all of like God mode where you can't die, and you have it so that you can bring in any weapon, the shit is boring. Right. It gets boring really fast without a challenge.
When you know that it's going to be perfect.
And
it takes the fun out of it.
You live forever? I don't want to live forever. I'm sorry. I just don't. That's a bad idea. Right. Like, he would eventually...
That's what makes life matter, and what part of what makes it meaningful. Part of what makes it's finite.
Yeah, part of what makes a lot of things meaningful is that they are finite. Which is probably maybe a weird thing for people to hear. I don't know. But I will say that, like... I feel like putting yourself back on the path, you would eventually become like a monster. Like, you know how like rich people behave?
Maybe that's how Voris started out.
Well, that's what I'm wondering. Like, you go into a world where you have control over everything, right? And you would eventually just become like a crazy. You would be like power mad, you know. You'd probably start like killing people for fun or some shit.
I thought it was good that he chose to go back home to his regular life And I thought it was good that Teresa had made that same choice as well.
She had. That was the subtext.
Right,
she had done the same thing.
She had gone through the same thing and had made her way back, which, you know, making your way back is not a given. Like, you
veer off the path and it kills you.
Right, yeah. So, like, logic says that there have been plenty of people who have walked on this path. You know, there's no guarantee that you're gonna make it to the end of this adventure or quest or whatever. And I thought it was really nice that in the end, you know, you discover that not only did these two people go through very similar situations just at different times, but that they both made it. And they both made it back to one another.
Right.
Like, that must have been her driving force, too, was just to get back to her husband and her children.
And that's, like, the true unspoken thing between them. They both chose each other through all that stuff, which is pretty amazing.
Oh.
Right? It was ultimately, like, a very, like, I don't know, it was a very life-affirming book,
yes.
I thought.
I want to read it. I listened to it on audiobooks, but I'd like to read it. It's not going to be, like, the next thing I read, but at some point.
Yeah. I kind of want to get a hard copy of it to put on our bookshelves.
Yeah.
But, we're coming up on an hour here, so I think we're going to wrap this up. I didn't think we'd be able to do a whole hour on a book.
I didn't think so either. But...
And maybe it hasn't been all worth listening to, and I apologize if we're still fine-tuning the audio of these new microphones.
But dang it, we've had fun discussing it.
Yeah.
So at least two people are enjoying this.
We've both been on the hike. We both chose each other, and fuck anyone who doesn't like our podcast.
That's right. That's the takeaway.
Yeah. That's the takeaway of this podcast. If you listen to all 56 minutes, fuck you.
Fuck you.
Anyway. All right. Well, hit us up with any questions, comments.
Just kidding. You guys are great. I'm sorry, honey.
I was trying to do an outro.
I'm sorry. Do the outro.
God damn it, Yana. Maybe I would choose the path. Just kidding. Just kidding. Ooh. The looks I'm getting. Anyway, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, hit us up at joinedattheunhip@gmail.com or at unhippod on Twitter. And if you would like to, please rate us on your podcast app of choice, especially if it's iTunes or Spotify.
Yep.
You guys have yourselves a wonderful week.
Bye-bye.